The message arrived on Earth at exactly 6 in the morning. It came through every communication channel at once, cutting through military frequencies and civilian broadcasts alike. The Galactic Concordance, the oldest and most powerful alliance of alien species in known space, had finally decided to talk. Admiral Catherine Brooks was drinking her third cup of coffee when her assistant burst into her office with the news. She had been awake for 36 hours, coordinating defense efforts along the outer colonies where human settlements were being systematically destroyed by Concordance forces. The war had been going on for 3 years now, and humanity was losing badly. She read the translated message carefully, her tired eyes moving over each word. High Arbiter Zorith Vel, the supreme leader of the Concordance, was inviting humanity to peace talks at Nexus Prime, a massive space station that served as neutral ground for diplomatic matters. The invitation promised safe passage and guaranteed that all human delegates would be protected under ancient galactic law. Catherine set down the message and looked out her window at the city of New Geneva. 2 centuries ago, humans had taken their first steps into space. They had been so excited, so full of hope about what they might find among the stars. Nobody had expected to find a galaxy already claimed by species, who saw humanity as nothing more than primitive newcomers. The first contact had gone badly. A human exploration vessel had accidentally crossed into Concordance territory and been destroyed without warning. When Earth demanded an explanation, the Concordance had simply stated that lesser species were expected to know their place. The war had started soon after, though calling it a war was generous. It was more like watching an adult swat at an annoying insect. Catherine called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Defense Council. The 7 members gathered within the hour, their faces showing the same exhaustion that Catherine felt. General Marcus Cole arrived first, his military uniform wrinkled from sleeping at his desk. Dr. Linda Morris came next, the Council's chief diplomatic advisor, followed by Commander Daniel Perry, the youngest member, at only 32 years old. They sat around the circular table in the underground bunker that served as humanity's last line of command. Above them, the city went about its daily business. Most civilians unaware of how close their species was to extinction. General Cole spoke first. His voice was rough from too many years of giving orders that sent young soldiers to their deaths. He did not trust the invitation. The Concordance had never shown any interest in negotiation before. Why would they start now, when they were clearly winning? Dr. Morris had a different view. She pointed out that the Concordance had blockaded Kepler Station for 8 months. 2 million human colonists were trapped there, slowly running out of food and medicine. If there was any chance of saving those people, they had to take it. Commander Perry pulled up a star map on the central display. He showed them the location of Nexus Prime, surrounded by 3 Concordance battle fleets. If this was a trap, the entire human diplomatic team would be captured or killed. But if they refused the invitation, they would look weak, and the Concordance would have an excuse to intensify their attacks. Catherine listened to each argument carefully. She had led humanity's defense forces for 5 years now. Ever since the previous admiral had been killed in the Battle of Proxima, she had watched thousands of young men and women die fighting against an enemy that barely considered them worth noticing. She had ordered retreats from colony after colony, leaving behind everyone who could not be evacuated in time. She was tired of retreating, but there was something else. Something that only a handful of people on Earth knew about. For the past 3 decades, a secret team of scientists had been working on a project that could change everything. They called it the Cascade Network, a system of quantum relay stations that would allow instantaneous travel across any distance. The technology was based on theoretical physics that the Concordance considered impossible. 18 months ago, the network had finally become operational. It was still experimental, still dangerous, but it worked. Hidden in the empty spaces between star systems, the relay stations had been quietly tested and refined while the war raged on. The Concordance had no idea they existed. Catherine had been planning to use the network as a last resort, a final desperate strike against Concordance homeworlds if humanity faced complete destruction. But now she wondered if there might be another way. She made her decision. They would accept the invitation, but they would go on their own terms. The diplomatic team would be led by Ambassador Jonathan Hayes, a career diplomat who had spent 20 years negotiating trade agreements with various alien species. He was calm, intelligent, and most importantly, he understood what was really at stake. Jonathan received the assignment that evening at his small apartment in the diplomatic quarter. He had been expecting the call, though he had hoped it would not come. He was 53 years old, with gray hair and kind eyes that hid a sharp mind. His wife had died 2 years ago in the bombing of the Luna settlement, and he had thrown himself into his work ever since. He spent the next 3 days preparing for the mission. He studied everything humanity knew about the Concordance, about High Arbiter Zorath Vel, about the political dynamics between the 7 founding species of the Alien Alliance. He memorized protocols and practiced responses to every possible scenario. Lieutenant Karen Shaw was assigned as his aide. She was young, only 28, but she had already proven herself in combat operations along the frontier. She had a quick mind and steady nerves, exactly what they would need if things went wrong at Nexus Prime, the night before departure. Catherine met with Jonathan privately in her office. She told him about the Cascade Network, about what it could do, and about what she needed him to accomplish. He listened without interruption, his face showing no emotion, even as the weight of her words settled on his shoulders. When she finished, he asked only one question. What if the Concordance refused to listen? What if they saw the network not as a reason for peace, but as a threat that needed to be eliminated? Catherine looked at him for a long moment before answering. Then humanity would show the galaxy that even the smallest species could bite back when cornered. They had spent 3 years being treated like insects. It was time to remind the Concordance that insects could swarm. Jonathan nodded slowly. He understood what she was really saying. This mission might end in peace, or it might end in the greatest battle humanity had ever fought. Either way, they would not go quietly. The diplomatic vessel Horizon's Edge departed Earth orbit at dawn on a Tuesday morning. As it accelerated toward the jump point that would take them to Concordance space, Jonathan stood at the observation window and watched his home planet shrink into the distance. He thought about his wife, about the life they had planned together, about all the things they would never get to do. He thought about the 2 million people trapped at Kepler Station, waiting to be rescued or abandoned. He thought about every human who had died in this war, every colony that had been destroyed, every child who had grown up afraid of the dark, between the stars. Then he turned away from the window and went to prepare for what lay ahead. Humanity had been given a choice between submission and extinction. Jonathan intended to offer them a third option. The journey to Nexus Prime would take 6 days. By the time they arrived, the galaxy would never be the same again. Nexus Prime appeared on their sensors 3 hours before they arrived. Even from that distance, the station was impressive. It stretched across 300 kilometers of space. A massive structure of metal and crystal that had been built over centuries by the combined efforts of a dozen species. Lights glittered along its surface like stars brought down from the sky. Jonathan stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Edge, watching the station grow larger on the main display. Karen Shaw stood beside him, her hand resting casually near her sidearm. Behind them, 4 ceremonial guards in dress uniforms waited in perfect silence. They looked impressive, but Jonathan knew that beneath those formal clothes, each guard carried enough hidden weapons to fight their way through a small army. The station's traffic control contacted them as they approached. A cold, mechanical voice gave them docking instructions and reminded them that all weapons were forbidden on Nexus Prime. Jonathan acknowledged the message and ordered the ship's captain to follow the assigned approach path as they got closer. They could see other ships gathered around the station. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of species, all here to witness the peace talks between the mighty Concordance and the upstart humans. Some had come as observers, others as representatives of species that had their own complicated relationships with the Galactic Alliance. A few were probably spies, trying to gather information about both sides. The Horizon's Edge docked at one of the station's smaller ports. Far from the grand entrances used by Concordance dignitaries, it was a deliberate insult, a way of reminding the humans that they were not considered equals. Jonathan had expected nothing less. They were met at the airlock by a delegation of Kethrani, one of the Concordance's founding species. The Kethrani were insectoid creatures, standing on 6 legs with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They served as administrators and bureaucrats throughout the Alliance, handling the countless details that kept such a vast organization running. The lead Kethrani introduced itself as supervisor. Vrexen informed them that they would be escorted to their quarters before the talks began. Jonathan thanked it politely and fell into step behind the alien delegation. As they walked, he studied the station around them. The corridors were enormous, built to accommodate species of all sizes. The walls were lined with screens showing news feeds from across the galaxy, most of them discussing the upcoming talks. Jonathan caught glimpses of himself on some of the screens, labeled as the human ambassador. The commentary was not flattering. They passed through a massive atrium that served as the station's central hub. Hundreds of aliens moved through the space, conducting business and socializing and watching the human delegation with undisguised curiosity. Jonathan saw Morveth, the silicon-based giants who formed the military backbone of the Concordance. He saw Talaxians, fluid beings contained in mechanical suits. He saw species he could not even identify, some beautiful and some terrifying. Karen leaned close to him as they walked. She whispered that she felt like an animal in a zoo, being studied by creatures who saw her as nothing more than an interesting specimen. Jonathan told her to let them look. By the time this was over, they would see humanity very differently. Their quarters were comfortable, but not luxurious. Connected rooms with basic furnishings. It's clearly designed for species that were not important enough to warrant special treatment. Jonathan thanked Supervisor Vrex for the accommodations and waited until the Kethrani delegation had left before speaking freely. He gathered his team in the main room and swept it for listening devices. They found 7, hidden in the walls and furniture, and even in the decorative plants that had been provided as a welcoming gift. They left the devices in place, but activated a counter-surveillance field that would prevent them from transmitting anything useful. Jonathan briefed his team on what to expect. High Arbiter Zorth Vel would almost certainly present terms that humanity could not accept. The Concordance would demand total surrender disguised as a peace agreement. They would expect the humans to be grateful for the opportunity to survive, even as slaves. The team waited 6 hours before they were summoned to the Chamber of Accords. It was another deliberate delay, designed to make them anxious and off balance. Jonathan used the time to meditate and prepare himself mentally for what was to come. The Chamber of Accords was the largest enclosed space Jonathan had ever seen. It was circular, nearly 1 kilometer across, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time image of the galaxy. 7 elevated platforms lined the walls, each one occupied by representatives of the Concordance's founding species. In the center, on a platform raised above all others, stood High Arbiter Zorth Vel. The Velanthi leader was magnificent and terrifying. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his body covered in scales that shifted color with each breath. His eyes were golden, slitted like a serpent's, and they tracked the human delegation with cold intelligence as they approached. Jonathan stopped exactly 15 meters from the central platform. It was the distance specified in the invitation, the maximum closeness permitted for species of humanity's status. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that did not quite reach submission. Zorth Vel's scales rippled with amusement. He welcomed the humans in a booming voice that echoed through the chamber, speaking of the Concordance's generosity in offering peace to such a young and foolish species. He talked about the natural order of the galaxy, where elder races guided and protected their younger counterparts. He made it sound almost kind. Then he presented his terms. Humanity would withdraw from all territory, claimed since their first contact with the Concordance. They would accept permanent restrictions on their technology, forbidden from ever developing. Anything beyond what the Concordance considered safe, they would submit to regular inspections and oversight, ensuring that they never again threatened the peace of civilized space. In exchange, the Concordance would stop killing them. Jonathan listened to each demand without expression. Beside him, Karen's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. The ceremonial guards shifted slightly, hands moving closer to hidden weapons. The chamber fell silent as the full weight of the proposal settled over the human delegation. These were not peace terms. They were surrender terms. The Concordance was not offering to end the war as equals. They were offering humanity a choice between slavery and extinction. Jonathan had known this was coming. Admiral Brooks had warned him that the Concordance would never see humans as worthy of respect. They were too old, too powerful, too certain of their own superiority. To them, humanity was nothing more than a pest that needed to be brought under control. He asked what would happen if humanity declined the generous offer. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he was discussing the weather rather than the fate of his entire species. Zorith Vel's scales flickered with something that might have been surprise. No species had ever declined Concordance terms. The concept seemed to genuinely confuse him. He recovered quickly, his voice dropping to a lower register as he explained. That rejection would be considered an act of aggression. The Concordance would respond with overwhelming force, containing the human threat by whatever means necessary. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, as if considering a reasonable business proposal. He asked for a recess to consult with his government. 6 hours, to discuss the terms and formulate a response. The High Arbiter granted the request with patronizing grace. Of course the young species needed time to understand their situation. Of course they needed to talk among themselves before accepting the inevitable. He would wait, confident that wisdom would eventually prevail. Jonathan bowed again, exactly as deep as before, and led his delegation out of the Chamber of Accords. As they walked back through the corridors of Nexus Prime, aliens watched them pass with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Everyone knew what the answer would be. Everyone knew that humanity had no choice. But as Jonathan reached their quarters and sealed the door behind them, he allowed himself a small smile. The Concordance thought they knew what was coming. They thought they understood human nature. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Jonathan connected the quantum communication link as soon as the door sealed behind them. The device was hidden inside what appeared to be a standard diplomatic briefcase, its true nature concealed. From the station's sensors by technology that the Concordance did not know existed, Admiral Catherine Brooks appeared on the small holographic display within seconds. Her face was calm, but Jonathan could see the tension in her eyes. She had been waiting for this call, knowing that everything they had worked for came down to this moment. He gave her a brief summary of the terms: total surrender, technological restrictions, permanent oversight. The Concordance wanted humanity to become a pet species, kept alive only as long as they remained obedient and harmless. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke 2 words that would change the course of galactic history: implement Protocol 17. Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat. He had known this was possible, had prepared for it during the long journey to Nexus Prime. But hearing the order spoken aloud made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. There would be no going back after this. He acknowledged the command and asked if there were any final instructions. Catherine told him to make sure the Concordance understood exactly what they were dealing with. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated. It was time to show the galaxy what happened when you pushed a young species too far. The communication ended, and Jonathan sat for a moment in silence. Karen and the guards watched him, waiting for orders. They did not know about Protocol 17. They did not know about the Cascade Network, or the secret fleet that had been hidden in the void between stars. They only knew that their ambassador suddenly looked like a different man. Jonathan stood and briefed them on what was about to happen. He explained about the network, about the relay stations, about the technology that would allow humanity to strike anywhere in the galaxy without warning. He told them about the fleets that had been positioned around Concordance homeworlds, waiting for a signal that would reveal their presence. Karen's eyes widened as she absorbed the information. The guards exchanged glances, their professional composure cracking for just a moment. This changed everything. This was not a desperate last stand. This was something else entirely. Jonathan gave them their instructions. When they returned to the Chamber of Accords, they were not to act like defeated diplomats begging for mercy. They were to act like representatives of a power that had nothing to fear. The concordance needed to understand that the balance had shifted, that the rules they had lived by for 1,000 years no longer applied. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Jonathan rehearsed his speech until every word was perfect. Karen checked and rechecked the demonstration device that would prove their claims were not bluffs. The guards loosened their ceremonial clothing, making it easier to access the weapons hid. And beneath, when the summons came to return to the Chamber of Accords, they were ready. The walk back through the station felt different this time. Jonathan noticed how the aliens who watched them pass seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. They were still powerful, still dangerous, but they were not invincible. Nothing was invincible. The Chamber of Accords was exactly as they had left it. High Arbiter Zorothvel stood on his elevated platform, surrounded by the Council of Seven Worlds. Hundreds of observers filled the viewing galleries. Waiting to witness humanity's surrender, Jonathan stopped at the same distance as before, but this time he did not bow. He simply stood straight and met the High Arbiter's golden eyes without flinching. Zoroth's scales rippled with curiosity. Something had changed about the human delegation. They carried themselves differently, stood differently, looked at him differently. The Volanthi leader had lived for over 300 years. He had seen countless species brought to heel by the concordance. He recognized confidence when he saw it. He asked if humanity had reached a decision. Jonathan said they had. But first, he wanted to share some information that the concordance might find interesting. He gestured to Karen, who stepped forward with the small device they had brought from their quarters. She activated it, and a holographic star map expanded to fill the center of the chamber. It was far more detailed than anything the concordance had shown, marking locations that their sensors had never detected. Jonathan explained about the Cascade Network. He kept his voice calm and professional, as if he was giving a routine briefing rather than revealing the greatest technological breakthrough in human history. He pointed out the relay stations hidden in the empty spaces that no one ever bothered to monitor. He explained how they worked, how they allowed instantaneous travel across any distance. The chamber erupted in murmurs. The Council of Seven Worlds shifted uneasily on their platforms. Zorothvel's scales flickered through a rapid series of colors that the human Sabates could not interpret. The High Arbiter declared it impossible. His voice was firm, but there was an edge to it that had not been there before. The physics required for such technology was theoretical at best. Dismissed by concordance scientists centuries ago, Jonathan smiled slightly and said that humanity had a habit of achieving the impossible when properly motivated. Then he nodded to Karen. She pressed a control on her wrist unit. For exactly 3 seconds, every light on Nexus Prime flickered. Somewhere deep in the station's systems, sensors detected something that should not have been there. Warning alarms began to sound before being quickly silenced by confused technicians. A new holographic display appeared in the chamber. It showed a fleet of human warships, hundreds strong, positioned in orbit around Volanthi Prime, the Concordance's capital world. The ships had appeared from nowhere, materializing in a location that had been empty moments before. Jonathan let the image speak for itself. That fleet had not existed in their sensor logs 60 seconds ago. Now it did. And similar fleets were currently positioned around every Concordance core world, waiting for orders. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in recorded history, someone had threatened the Concordance on their own territory. For the first time, the elder species of the galaxy faced an enemy. They could not simply overwhelm with superior numbers and technology. Zorothvel's scales had gone completely gray. It was a Volanthi expression of profound shock, one that no diplomatic training could hide. He stared at the holographic display showing human ships around his homeworld. And for just a moment, he looked old. Jonathan told him that they had not come to accept terms. They had come to deliver their own. Humanity was not interested in surrender. They were not interested in becoming a pet species, controlled and restricted by their supposed betters. They had spent 3 years fighting a war they could not win, watching their colonies burn and their people die, all because the Concordance could not imagine a galaxy where younger species were treated as equals. That ended today. Jonathan laid out humanity's position. They wanted recognition as a sovereign species with the right to expand and develop without restrictions. They wanted the blockade of Kepler's station lifted immediately. They wanted the concordance to acknowledge that humanity had earned its place among the stars through determination and ingenuity, not through the permission of elder races. And if the concordance refused, then humanity would demonstrate exactly what the Cascade Network was capable of. They would show the galaxy that even the mightiest civilizations could fall when they forgot that every species, no matter how young, had the right to exist on its own terms. Zoroth Vel found his voice at last. He asked if this was a declaration of war. Jonathan shook his head. It was a declaration of independence. Humanity was not looking for conquest or revenge. They simply wanted to be left alone to build their own future. The concordance could accept that reality. They could learn the hard way that humans did not surrender. The choice was theirs. The Chamber of Accords had never been so quiet. 1,000 years of galactic diplomacy had taken place within these walls, but nothing like this had ever happened before. The great powers of the concordance, the elder species who had shaped civilization across 1 million star systems, sat in stunned silence as a young species from a small planet told them that the old rules no longer applied. Hi, Arbiter. Zoroth Vel stared at the holographic display showing human warships around his homeworld. His scales had stopped shifting, frozen in the gray coloration of shock. Around him, Council of 7 Worlds whispered among themselves in languages that the human translators struggled to interpret. The Morvith representative was the first to speak. The silicon-based giant rose to its full height, its crystalline body humming with energy that made the air crackle. It demanded to know what would happen if the concordance chose to fight. If they mobilized their combined fleets and destroyed the human network before it could spread? Karen, Shaw answered, before Jonathan could respond. Her voice was steady, without any trace of fear. She explained that the Cascade Network was not just a transportation system. Every relay station was equipped with quantum-linked warheads, weapons that could destabilize the cores of military installations across thousands of light years. If the concordance attacked, humanity would lose everything. Their fleets would be destroyed, their colonies burned, their species potentially exterminated. But the concordance would lose just as much. Their shipyards, their academies, their ancient monuments to 1,000 years of civilization. Everything they had built would burn alongside everything humanity had built. She stepped closer to the Council's platform. Meeting their various gazes without flinching, humanity had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive against a larger predator was to make the cost of attacking unacceptable. The concordance had wanted humans contained, controlled, kept safely beneath their notice. Instead, they had taught humanity exactly what was needed to threaten them. Zoroth Vel's scales slowly began to shift again, cycling through colors that indicated deep thought. He had ruled the concordance for over a century, guiding the Alliance through conflicts and crises that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. He had never faced a situation quite like this. He asked what humanity actually wanted. Not demands, not threats. What did they truly hope to achieve? Jonathan considered the question carefully before answering. He said that humanity wanted something very simple. They wanted to exist. Not as servants or subjects or protected species. They wanted to exist as equals, with the freedom to grow and learn and make their own mistakes. He produced a small data crystal from his pocket and placed it on the central platform. It contained coordinates and access protocols for 13 independent worlds in the outer territories, colonies that the concordance's expansion had left behind, species that had been deemed too insignificant to incorporate into the Alliance. Humanity had been in contact with them for years, building relationships and sharing technology. As of that morning, they had agreed to form a new alliance, not an alliance against the concordance. An alliance for something better than the concordance? The Volanthi elder's golden eyes studied the data crystal as if it might explode. He asked what kind of alliance humanity was proposing. What would make it different from the concordance itself? Jonathan explained that the concordance was built on hierarchy and control. Elder species at the top, younger species at the bottom, everyone knowing their place in an order that never changed. The new alliance would be built on cooperation and mutual respect. No species would be considered superior to another simply because they had existed longer. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. The Concordants could join them eventually if they learned to see other species as partners instead of subjects. The door would remain open, but humanity would not wait for permission to start building a better future. The Talaxian representative spoke next, its fluid form rippling inside its containment suit. It asked if humanity truly believed they could change a system that had governed the galaxy for a millennium. Did they not understand how naive such hopes appeared? Jonathan admitted that they might fail. They might be wrong about everything. But humanity had spent its entire history attempting things that seemed impossible. They had crossed oceans that others said could not be crossed. They had built cities that others said could not be built. They had reached the stars when other species had assumed they would. Destroy themselves long before leaving their own planet. Being told something was impossible had never stopped humans before. He saw no reason to start now. Zorthvel rose from his seated position, his massive form casting a shadow across the chamber floor. He descended from his platform, something that had not happened in any diplomatic session for over 3 centuries. The Council of 7 Worlds watched in astonishment as their supreme leader approached the human delegation. He stopped a few meters from Jonathan, close enough that the ambassador could see the individual scales on the Valanthi's face. Close enough to smell the strange electric scent of an alien body. The High Arbiter spoke quietly, his words meant only for Jonathan. He said that in 300 years of life he had never seen a species behave this way. Every other young race had accepted their place, had understood that survival depended on submission. What made humans different? Jonathan met his gaze without looking away. He said that humans had a long memory for injustice. They remembered every time they had been told to know their place, every time they had been dismissed as insignificant, every time someone more powerful had assumed they would simply accept their fate. That memory did not make them angry. It made them determined. Zorthvel was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, what would happen now? What was humanity's next move? Jonathan stepped back and looked around the chamber. At the council members and the observers and the countless aliens who had gathered to watch humanity surrender, he announced that there was nothing more to discuss today. The Concordants knew humanity's position. They knew what humans were capable of. When they were ready to discuss genuine partnership between equals, they knew how to make contact. Until then, his conversation was over. He turned and began walking toward the chamber exit. Karen fell into step beside him, followed by the 4 guards. Their footsteps echoed in the silent space, each one carrying them further from the center of galactic power. Zorthvel called after them, his voice ringing through the chamber. He demanded to know if they were really leaving. They had not agreed to anything. Nothing had been decided. Jonathan paused at the doorway, looking back at the assembled might of the galaxy's oldest civilization. He acknowledged that the High Arbiter was correct. They had not agreed to anything. Neither had the Concordants. The difference was that humanity did not need the Concordance's agreement to exist. He thanked them for their time and said he would see himself out. Then the human delegation walked through the doorway and disappeared. From the Chamber of Accords, leaving behind 1,000 years of galactic certainty and ruins, the walk back to their ship was the longest of Jonathan's life. Every step took them through corridors filled with aliens who had expected to witness humanity's surrender. Every step carried them past observers who were already transmitting news of what had happened to every corner of the galaxy. No one tried to stop them. No one even spoke to them. The station seemed frozen, paralyzed by the impossibility of what had just occurred. When they reached the horizon's edge, Jonathan sealed the airlock behind them and ordered an immediate departure. The ship undocked from Nexus. Primon began accelerating toward the jump point that would take them home. Only when they had cleared the station's defensive perimeter did Jonathan allow himself to breathe. Karen asked him if he thought it had worked. If the Concordants would actually accept humanity's terms, Jonathan watched the massive station shrink on the display, becoming just another point of light among millions. He admitted that he did not know. Maybe the Concordants would accept reality and begin treating humanity as equals. Maybe they would decide that humans were too dangerous to allow and launch an attack that would destroy both sides. Either way, humanity had finally been heard. After 3 years of being ignored and dismissed and treated like insects, they had stood in the heart of galactic power and refused to kneel. Whatever happened next, they would face it on their feet. 3 months had passed since the day humanity walked out of the Chamber of Accords. In that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that historians would debate for centuries to come. Admiral Catherine Brooks stood on the observation deck of Relay Station Alpha, the first of the Cascade Network's hubs to be officially revealed to the public. The station floated in the deep void between star systems, far from any sun or planet, a monument to human determination built in the emptiest place imaginable, through the transparent walls. She watched ships from 17 different species pass through the quantum fields that made instantaneous travel possible. Kathrani traders carrying exotic goods from the Outer Rim. Morvith diplomatic cruisers painted in colors that indicated peaceful intent. Talaxian research vessels eager to study the technology that had changed everything. None of them had been part of the original 13 worlds that joined humanity's alliance. They had come later, in the weeks following the summit, drawn by the promise of something different. Something better than the hierarchy they had lived under for so long. Commander Daniel Perry approached with a data tablet, his expression carefully neutral. He reported that the Valanthi ambassador was requesting another meeting. It was the 5th request that week. Catherine asked if it was Zorithvel making the request. Daniel shook his head and explained that the High Arbiter had retired to his family estates on Valanthi Prime shortly after the summit. The official announcement said he was pursuing philosophical studies, whatever that meant for a 300-year-old alien leader. Catherine allowed herself a small smile. She imagined the former ruler of the Concordance sitting in his ancestral home, trying to understand how a species that had barely discovered fire by his measurement had managed to append 1,000 years of galactic order in a single afternoon, she told Daniel to schedule the meeting for next week. There was no need to rush. The Concordance knew where to find them. Below the observation deck, the station hummed with activity. Engineers monitored the quantum fields that made the network function. Scientists studied data from the relay stations scattered across known space. Diplomats prepared for the first Council of Free Worlds Assembly, scheduled to begin in 3 days. The council would bring together representatives from all the species that had joined humanity's alliance, 23 worlds at last count, with more applications arriving every day. Some were former Concordance members who had grown tired of being treated as lesser partners. Others were independent species who had survived in the margins of galactic civilization. Too small to matter, but too stubborn to disappear, they were building something new. Not an empire, not a hierarchy. A partnership of equals, bound together by shared values rather than fear. On Earth, the celebrations had lasted for weeks. Jonathan Hayes had become the most famous human in history. Though he consistently deflected credit to the scientists who had made the Cascade Network possible, he had returned to his diplomatic duties, now working to establish trade agreements and cultural exchanges with their new allies. Karen Shaw had been promoted to commander and given her own ship, one of the new vessels built specifically to use the Cascade Network's capabilities. She spent her days patrolling the Alliance's borders, not looking for fights, but making sure everyone knew that humanity could respond to any threat instantly. The blockade of Kepler Station had ended within hours of the summit's conclusion. 2 million colonists, saved from starvation and death by a technology that the Concordance had insisted was impossible. Ships from a dozen species had arrived with food and medicine. The first tangible proof that humanity's gamble had paid off, but not everyone celebrated. Catherine knew that the victory at Nexus Prime had been built on a foundation of bluffs and desperate improvisation. The Cascade Network had been years away from completion when the Concordance's invitation arrived. The demonstration that had shocked the galaxy had nearly failed. The relay stations barely holding together under the strain of transporting an entire fleet instantaneously. If the lights on Nexus Prime had flickered for 4 seconds instead of 3, if the network had collapsed during the demonstration, everything would have been different. Humanity would have been revealed as liars, their threats exposed as empty posturing. The Concordants would have responded with overwhelming force. Earth would have burned. They had bet everything on a technology that was not ready, trusting that it would work when they needed it most. They had walked into the heart of galactic power with nothing but confidence and the desperate hope that their enemies would not call their bluff. It was not the kind of victory that made for comfortable sleeping, but it was the only victory they could have won. 6 months after the summit, the Galactic Concordants formally requested observer status at the Council of Free Worlds. The request was approved unanimously, with one condition. They would participate as equals, not as leaders. They would have one vote, the same as every other species, regardless of how old or powerful they believed themselves to be. Zoroth. Vel sent a personal message to Admiral Brooks on the day the decision was announced. It contained only a few words in the Velanthi language, which the translation software struggled to interpret. The closest approximation was something like understanding finally achieved. Though the nuances were difficult to capture in human speech, Catherine read the message in her private. Quarters aboard Relay Station Alpha. She thought about responding, about beginning a dialogue with the being who had once planned to reduce her species to servitude, but she decided to wait. There would be time later for reconciliation. For now, it was enough to know that the galaxy was changing. The old order, built on hierarchy and control, and the assumption that power meant the right to rule, was crumbling. Something new was being built in its place. Something that no one could quite describe yet, but everyone could feel. Jonathan. Hayes gave a speech at the first council assembly. Standing before representatives of species that had never before been considered worthy of having a voice, he talked about the future they were building, about the challenges they would face, about the importance of treating every species as valuable regardless of how long they had existed. He did not talk about military, strength, or technological superiority. He talked about cooperation and respect and the simple belief that every intelligent being deserved the chance to reach for the stars. When he finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the applause began, spreading from delegation to delegation until the entire assembly was on its feet. Catherine watched the broadcast from her observation deck, surrounded by the hum of human technology and the glow of alien ships passing through the network. She thought about the 3 years of war, the colonies burned, the lives lost. She thought about the scientists who had worked in secret for decades, the soldiers who had died buying time, the diplomats who had walked into impossible situations with nothing but their wits and their courage. They had not conquered their way to this moment. They had not built an empire through force and fear. They had simply refused to accept that their place in the galaxy was determined by anyone but themselves. Some species earned respect through age and tradition. Some earned it through military might and territorial expansion. Humanity had earned it by walking into the heart of an empire that had ruled for 1,000 years and saying no. It was not the ending anyone had expected. But then again, humanity had never been very good at meeting expectations. The stars stretched out before her, infinite and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, new species were taking their first steps into space. Looking up at the same sky and wondering what they might find, they would discover a galaxy that was still dangerous, still complicated, still full of species who might try to control or exploit them, but they would also discover that someone had walked this path before them. Someone had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. Someone had proven that even the youngest species could stand tall among the oldest, that even the smallest voice could shake the foundations of empire. Humanity had shown the galaxy what was possible when you refused to kneel, and the galaxy would never be the same again.